I'd like to welcome everyone to the October CIECAST, CIECA 2022 R2 release. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director of CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members on trends that impact systems, processes, and the exchange of data across the industry. Today's presenters are Paulette Reed, Technical Project Manager for CIECA, Dan Webster, Principal Architect, IT Enterprise for Enlight, and Mike Hastings, Product Manager at carpart.com. As we start the webinar, I want to remind you there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenters. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it in the question panel on the webinar screen. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Paulette.
Thank you, Paul. So to kick off our meeting, I wanted to give a huge thank you and congratulations to Andy Bober, Mike Hastings, and Dan Webster. They will all be receiving an award at SEMA for their outstanding contribution and for all of their help that they've made on making this CAPIS project a success. We've had many virtual meetings and even 2 face-to-face meetings to get this work for this release. So thank you all and congratulations. I wanted to go over our agenda for today. First, we will have Dan speaking on the BMS update, and then Dan will also give us the overall update on the CAPIS release, which is our first release for our APIs. And then I will give a review of how to find these standards, and then Mike will show you how to work with the standards and different tools that the industry is using. And then we will have the question and answer session. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Webster.
Thank you, Paulette. I'm going to do as I habitually do twice a year after a BMS release from CIECA, go over what the recent changes were. I was going back over the archived releases on the website today to see that this will be our 49th release of BMS. So that's our becoming pretty routine now, every 6 months for 20 some years now. And it's becoming routine in that we have a automated build. We have processes where the architecture committee organizes QA sessions and automated testing to go along with it. And I don't want to spend very much time on that today, but what you see in the BMS on the boxes here just talks about new data elements that have been added to the schemas and messages. I'll just highlight a couple of them. The top left, the ref claim number had been a high up element in the estimate messages since the beginning, and we neglected to put it in the assignment, and finally noticed that after all these years and corrected that for some of our members' workflows. There are various and sundry other elements added, but the ones across the middle, you're probably familiar from the insurance industry for deductible credit, betterment credit, and previous payment amounts, which had never been formally supported in BMS, and now they are. And I think those are the only things I want to mention, but you can see there were 9 additions of elements to objects. Then on the code lists, this is another thing, one of the most important things CIECA is involved in is standardizing codes. This was a part of the EDI standards way back when, certainly as part of EMS that we're still using today. And now in the BMS XML, we are highlighting 9 code lists that got additions this time around. I only really want to highlight the center of the top row that the Certified Alternate Parts Association has come up with a new certification, CAPA Tier 1, which I'm thinking a lot of folks in the industry will be familiar with. And so as a standards organization, CIECA had to come up with a code for it. These are all one-letter codes if you want to know why O became the code for CAPA Tier 1. But yeah, we've got this one and a handful of other changes. If you want to move on through the presentation, Paulette, the reason I'm rushing everyone through what is usually the focus of this technical webinar for BMS changes is that this release, as of yesterday, contains the first ever version of our next generation standard, CAPIS we're calling it, for CIECA Application Programming Interface Standard. And as we did with BMS in 2003, the very first version has humble version number of 0.0.1, but this next generation is a big deal to those of us who have worked on it. It means we have support for application programming interfaces, that's what APIs are, and the JavaScript object notation, JSON data format, using the Open API specification standard, often called OAS or Swagger. And CIECA has been studying these technologies, particularly JSON, since 2013. More recently, probably since 2020, we've spent time and energy focusing on Open API, that standard. And now we've come out with a process for moving forward, and I think will be shown to be working pretty effectively. You'll see on the top row here, it's founded on these blocks, which started with the one in the middle, a CAPIS JSON style guide. So how we were going to use the JSON object notation to represent the familiar messages that we've been passing back and forth for all these decades in the technology of the day. It specified things like flattening, as you see in the rightmost top block, that rather than the artificial construct we had adopted in designing BMS XML, where we would break down every object into further sub-objects until you never had a list of more than 10 or 11, I think it was. The current practice is have your lists be as long as they need to be in a flat structure. I think the buzzword we use is with no extraneous levels of hierarchy. And then that means we get to have arguments every week about what extraneous means and whether we need more or fewer levels of hierarchy. But what you'll see in these messages is much longer lists of data elements and many fewer artificial levels of hierarchy. Then along with a JSON style guide, which ran to a couple pages and said how you're supposed to use the standard a rendering format for what do we call it? Not kebab case, but camel case is what we're using for this. And then in the schema guidelines, similarly, we talk about things like a standard way to use codes, how to represent arrays, etc., etc. And those, we kind of put those as a stake in the ground probably the better part of a year ago, and then have been moving forward, making the new standard and following them. When you move down to the second row, what we decided was we should have definitions of what is essentially CIECA's data dictionary. And this would be all the hundreds of pages of tables in the Word document, the BMS doc currently in our current standard. And we've got this all into one file, which we call the properties data dictionary definitions. And our thinking was that we should define every property that CIECA supports exactly once, and then reference it everywhere else when it happens in a message. And that sounds intuitive now that we've come up with that practice, but we did find in researching what we've done in the past with BMS that when a element with the same name would be used in BMS in different messages, we would endeavor to describe it the same way and with the same attributes, etc. And we did that kind of manually with side-by-side comparison, that sort of thing. And now structurally, we're doing that by defining it only once and carefully making sure the messages themselves are built from references to the dictionary rather than new definitions. The very center of the whole thing here is the code list. And again, it's something that's been our practice from EDI and DBase and XML days to support various data elements with enumerations of what codes are expected and allowed. And we've got the next generation of that too in a code list schema in JSON. And then we moved on. Well, I guess the bottom right corner, test instances examples, has been a obsession of the CIECA architecture committee for quite a while now. And the idea was actually show your work, show what a message will look like once you've put your needed interface into the format that we've specified. And then when we do a schema or an open API specification, we can validate it and prove that what you've set out to do achieves what you need. And we've got, I don't know, something along the order of 100 of these test instances that we've been using in the development of CAPIS today. And what CAPIS consists of is we started out by limiting the scope to the three important, maybe not always the most important, but the vehicle, parties, and claims objects that we've had, again, since EMS and EDI days. And they're each described in the JSON schema and JSON format, and then combined into messages that Mike will be demonstrating a little later here. But the idea is with these, limiting the scope to a vehicle, a claim, and parties, which if it doesn't sound familiar to you, that formerly went by the name of admin information in the BMS, but basically we're talking about owner, claimant, insured, body shop, all those things are parties. And that scope, although small compared to the expansive BMS, it's what BMS called the claim save service in chapter 16. And it was how you could initiate a claim from one trading partner system onto the other one and synchronize on the various components and values within there. At the bottom, you just see that we made schemas out of it and calling it vehicle parties claim API. We built a open API standard document for it, the open API spec. And I think I've given you the overview that will lead into Mike showing you, or Mike and Paulette showing you what we came up with. And I'm hoping you will like it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. So I am going to give a real brief overview of how to find our standards. So of course, these are all on our CIECA page. Again, when you're in CIECA and you want to look at the standards, you need to be signed into your account. Otherwise, it'll give you a sign-on page. So I'm going to exit out of that for a second. So in standards, if you go to products, we have our BMS API, and underneath we will have our EMS standards. Our BMS standards, when you click on that link, it takes you to the same link that is in our services, because right now our BMS has all of our service types. But we did create a API version of this. And you can see, as Dan said, we have a claim service with API. So it is the only one that is seen here, much like the EMS only has the assignment. So we have the CAPIS guidelines, which Dan spoke of in his presentation. And here we have just our JSON schema guidelines. We have our JSON style guide, which has our definitions, our general guidelines, property name guidelines, just all the information that we've been working on through the last year to share with you. And then we have a how-to with the CIECA architecture overview. And this is basically just talking more about our process and how you can get your APIs and your needs to work with CIECA, or work with CIECA to get those published as a standard. If we go back and again, products, services, and then if you go to claims, if you click on this claims, it's the same claims that's under the BMS. So if you're familiar with the BMS and the new CIECA simplified approach that we've been taking, again, you'll see the same use cases, workflows, the data dictionary, the code list, and under the code, it has the BMS version, which will take you into the XML so you can see that, or you can go into the API. And I'm not going to click on that now because it's the same information that we're going to click on in a little bit to show you that, and then I'll turn it over to Mike to go over that information. But with the claim save, you can see we do have a CIECA API message. And if you click on that, it brings up our claim service. So we have a get, a patch, a delete, a put, and a post. And then again, you have the release to get to the API release and to get to the guidelines. You have the links there to get to those. But under each of these, they have like a shortcut. But if you get a get, you can see if you do the parameters, it'll show you the parameters that are needed for this. And then it will also show you an example message. And then in our responses, it will show you a response with data in it and how that would look. And then if you wanted to click on the create, you would see the same type of information. You would see the body has all these different objects in it. And then here is an example of a create. So that is the how you find our standards and the type of information that we're sharing with those API standards. The next thing that I wanted to show is under standards. If you're signed on, you could see the CIECA releases. And then we have our release structure here. So since API is new, we put it on top. The BMS and the EMS is underneath. So if you click on the API release anywhere in this document, you will be brought up to our latest release. You can see the CAPIS 0.0.1 zip file. And this is where Mike is going to start everybody. So hold on just a second, Mike, and I will give.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye, this is Mike. I got a nice picture of Mike out here.
Okay. Again, I'm Mike Hastings. I'm one of the CIECA architects. I've actually been working on the API. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools we've been using. And then I'm going to do a demo in Stoplight of our new API. And before I show my screen, I've got one slide here on the Open API tools. basically for CAPIS, the requirements we have is we're using the Open API version 3.1, and then we're also using the JSON schema draft 2020-12. And that's important. These standards are fairly new, and there's not a lot of tools that work with them yet. We've been using XML Spy for probably a year and a half now for schema development, and it was one of the first tools that supported the 2020-12 JSON schema draft. For the Open API development, I've been using Stoplight.io Studio, and that's what I'm going to give a demo on. And then the other tool I've used for years called Postman, mainly used it in the past for testing web APIs, both SOAP and REST. They're supporting in their version 10, Open API version 3.1. So that's another tool you can use. And that's kind of exciting because that's a very popular tool. And now I'll switch in and do a demo. Okay, show my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. Basically, I'm within Stoplight Studio, and I'm showing our new claim service. Stoplight Studio basically has two modes. One mode is basically what I call the production documentation view, and this can be mainly used for reviewing and working testing an API. And then the other mode is if you click the edit button here, you go into a developer mode. And typically the developer mode is you can go in and develop the API. So if I want to create a new API or add additional methods or functions to an API, I would go into the edit. And you can see over here, we have the claim service. Then I have basically a tag here called claims. So you can see within the claims, we have these different methods or functions that you could do on a claim. And the first one here I have selected is create a new claim. And basically it's going to show the URL, and then actually you'll see the path, which is called claims. And this example will actually post a message, which is a claim to the REST service. And basically it's going to include a body. And I have an example over here. Typically our claim includes a vehicle. So we've got a vehicle, and then we have a bunch of party types. So here we've got an insured, an owner, and then other parties, and then the claim information follows. And in this example, basically we have the original claim that we created a new claim out on the server with. And then we have some scenarios where we actually updated some of the data. So if I look at the claim information, you'll see here that we really don't have an deductible amount. So if I go to the put method allows us to update the claim information. And typically it's going to allow us to send a complete new claim, which will update the existing one that we did on the post. And we have like 3 different examples. The first one here I'll show you is we updated the deductible information, and you'll see down here, I think it's $250 we added. And then the next example is we added in an adjuster. So we should see an adjuster ID in here now. And then the third example was a license plate. So we figured out what the license plate was for the vehicle, and you can see it added a license plate in there. So the put allows you to update the claim data. We also have a function up here, get. So if you want to retrieve the claim, and in this case, basically you provide the claim number as a parameter on the query string, and then it's going to return back the claim information. And we have 4 different examples. We have the original claim, and then we have the 3 changes we did: the deductible, the adjuster ID, and the license plate information. let's see. We also include a function for delete, so you can provide a claim number and it'll go in and delete the claim. And then there's also provisions for patch, and patch can be used if we don't want to update the whole claim. There's just certain properties or fields in the claim that we want to update. I guess the other thing I wanted to show you, if I go into edit here, this will take me into the developer mode of Stoplight Studio, and I can actually, if I right click here, it allows me to export. So I can export the API, and basically it's called a reference. You can export it in either JSON format or YAML format. So basically the file I export is the one that we've included in the release, the CAPIS release. And you can use that file to import into other tools, and also for generating code for your either your server side or your client side. The other thing is I can actually show you the code. So one of the things basically what we're looking at right now is not JSON, it's called YAML. And YAML is another markup language used in Open API and REST services. And it's got a different syntax. Stoplight Studio will work with both JSON and YAML. So we support both of those formats in the release. And the next thing I wanted to show you is how to actually import the Open API file into Postman. So I'm going to try to bring up, let's see here, Postman. And let's see here. So basically, I'm running Postman version 10.0. You can also use version 9. In 10.0, they actually added some additional features for Open API version 3.1. And typically, in order to bring in the CAPIS release file, you click import, and then you go and browse to the release. And basically here, let's see, I'll walk through my. So I've got the new release. I downloaded the zip file and then I unpacked it. And then actually, to find the Open API file, you go into Vehicle Parties Claim API, you go to Open API Spec, you go to Reference, and then I'm going to import the JSON file. It's called claim-service.json. And it brings it up here under, I click the import button, and then you'll see it shows up here. And basically I can click on the claim service on these ellipses. I can come down and select view documentation, and then basically our new CAPIS claim service shows up within Postman. And they've added features into Postman where you can actually create an Open API spec, just like I'm doing in Stoplight. But I found that Stoplight is more advanced. I think Postman's kind of adding these features to compete with what Stoplight is doing. But it's kind of exciting. There's a lot of new tools coming out. I know Swagger, which is probably the most common tool, they have the Open API version 3.1. It's in development. I don't know when it'll be released, but they're working on it. And anyways, I'll turn it over to Paulette, and I guess we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mike.
How do I, let's see here.
I'll switch it over.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so I don't see any questions in the question log at this time. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to post? I'll give everybody a
While
few
we're
seconds.
waiting on that, Paulette, I can't believe I made no mention of zero-based budgeting, which again has been an obsession for the last few years. So I want to mention that in that we see the next generation standard as a great opportunity to get control over our standard that has just grown and grown and grown and offered backward compatibility for anything anyone has ever suggested. And what we're doing now as part of this focus on test instances and examples of everything you're doing is just that. We're not going to add something to the new CAPIS standard if we can't think of a example of it and actually fill in whatever the pattern is supposed to be. And that's been lively discussion, but pretty much been embraced by everyone who's been working on this. So just wanted to make up for neglecting to mention that.
So if you're looking at the new API and you see a field in vehicle, for example, that you use all the time, just let us know. So and give us an example of that and we can get it added back in. But like Dan said, with the zero-based budgeting, if we didn't have any messages or examples, we would remove some things because we know that we always did backward compatibility with the BMS. So we never removed anything. So it would be backward compatible, but we didn't want to add things to the API version if it didn't need to be there. So if you do see something missing, it's not gone forever. Just let us know and give us an example so we can have those and get those built. Well, I don't see any questions. Paul and Stacy, do you have anything that you would like to add?
Just Paulette, any plans on what the next services are that we'll be working on as part of the CAPIS release?
We were working on part. So Mike, do you want to give a little update on that? I know that you're working really hard on that.
Yeah, so kind of the plan is to start up in November the parts committee and come up with some parts APIs, you know, for doing requests for quotes, orders, that sort of thing. You know, we had pretty comprehensive messages in the PMP, but over the years, I've heard that it's been very difficult to implement. So kind of the goal with these new parts APIs would be to simplify things and make it easy for developers to implement. So that's kind of the goal. And, you know, we kind of plan to achieve that kind of using what Dan mentioned earlier, where we, you know, we're trying to flatten and eliminate a lot of redundant properties or fields that were never used. And the PMP, the actually procurement folder was very complicated, you know, where it had, you know, many different levels of hierarchy in the objects. And kind of the goal again is to try to simplify that.
Yeah, we will be kicking off the PMP committee. The other committees that we have going right now is, of course, our Emerging Technologies Committee, our AI Committee, our OEM Repair Procedure and Build Sheet Committee. We have the referral that was kicked off. So we have a lot of stuff going on and we don't really know if it will be API, BMS, both when we get to the committees. We're just looking at the better solutions and for standards.
Great.
If you're interested in any of those committees, just reach out to us and let us know. And there's a link on our webpage that will send us a referral, or you can just reach out to us personally via email.
All right. Well, thank you. With no other questions then, thank you, Paulette, Dan, and Mike for this presentation. Good information. And I'm sure we'll be learning a lot more about CAPIS in the future. This presentation has been recorded and will be available later today at CIECA.com. I would invite you to check CIECA.com for a schedule of future broadcasts and to watch recordings of past webinars. Links are available under the CIECAST tab at the top of the page. Please follow CIECA's social media platforms to stay up to date on coming events and CIECA news. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you.